Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Dies sind die heilgen, zehn Gebot, which translates to These are the 10 holy commandments. Very unusual chorale. Has a couple of quirky chord progressions, but the key choices, the end of the chorale, both are very interesting. They have their own unique profile that give this chorale its own sort of memorable event that's definitely going to stick in the back of my mind for the rest of my time spending any amount of energy looking at the chorales. So we're just going to hop right into the analysis. We have no key signature. We start with G major. We end with G major. I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is C major, but because we end with G major, you might be thinking ahead and already saying to yourself it's kind of unusual that Bach isn't ending with a tonic triad, and that would be correct. Bach usually ends with a tonic triad, but we have a half cadence at the end of this chorale, so something to look forward to. G major at the beginning is our 5 chord, passing 7th in the bass, E, C, E, and G. That's our tonic triad, C major in first inversion. Passing tone in the bass, C, D, F, and G. I reckon this C is an accented non-chord tone, and rather we have B, D, F, and G, which is G7 over B, that's 5, 6, 5, and then we have C, D, E, and G. This is a bit of an interesting chord. I reckon this D is functioning like a 9/8 suspension, and we are getting a tonic, but typical Bach to change the bass by the time that we get the resolution. After this passing tone, we have E, C, E, and G, which is just taking our tonic triad and putting it in first inversion, as opposed to resolving it and keeping the bass static. Passing tone in the bass, G, B, D, and G, that's our 5 chord, G major. Passing tones in the tenor and the melody before we get G, G, D, and B. Another 5 chord, no need to reanalyze. E is a non-chord tone, F's a little neighboring 7th here before a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major, tonic triad, root position. Moving ahead, we have another perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major, and this is the first phrase that starts to take the chords and the harmony, I guess just the harmony in general, off of the the well-paved tonal path, because this first phrase is just 1s and 5s, right? This starts to introduce some of the more interesting harmony we're going to see later in the chorale as well. We start off with F major, F, A, F, and C, which is our 4 chord. Passing tone in the bass, a little non-chord tone. No, this C is a chord tone, we don't need to mark it. This G is a non-chord tone, so we have C, C, G, and C here. Sorry, this is an E, E, C, G, and C, which is our tonic triad and first inversion happening in passing here. We then have D, F, A, and D, which is our 2 chord D minor. Passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto. That leaves us with E, F, G, and D. Not really an analyzable chord here. We then have F, A, F, and D, which is just taking our D minor chord and putting it in first inversion, so we'll just change the figured bass up. Passing tones in the lower voices. This is an analyzable chord. G, B, F, and D is G7. It's a 5/7 chord, and that takes us to A minor, A, C, F, and C. Apologies, not A minor. I read this F as an A. F major over A, which is 4/6. A little bit of a take on a deceptive progression. We have the resolution in the bass like a deceptive progression, but we have F rather than E. And then we have another passing tone here. Remember, with 4/6 chords that ascend like this to a tonic triad, C, C, E, and G. This F is a 4/3 suspension. Bare minimum, we have the leading tone or some type of connecting 7th between the 6th and the tonic here in the bass. Now we're closing in on the cadence, and this is pretty interesting here. We have G, B, D, and G. That's our 5 chord. Not the interesting part yet. But then 5, so close to the cadence, gives us a bit of a turnaround. We have F, we have A, we have A, and we have D. That's D minor over F, which is 2/6. We would expect 2/6 to go to 5, but sometimes 5 goes to 2/6 because of the fact that chords that are a 5th apart have a tendency to want to go to one another because they share one tone in common, and that sort of smooths the progression, I suppose. But 5 going to 2 so close to the cadence, we typically would expect it to go the other way, because 2 going to 5 going to 1 is a very normative chord progression we would see in cadences. So after 2-6, we go to a very interesting chord in a cadential context, E, G, G, and B, which is E minor. So we get some adjacent harmony here. That is where the roots are next to one another in the chord. And then afterwards, this is probably the most fascinating progression, because we do see 3 going to 5 in some contexts, right? D, G, F, and B, which is G7 over D. That's a 5-4-3 chord. But 3 going to 5, one of the less common chord formulas that we would see going into a tonal cadence in Bach. We do see it from time to time, 3 going to 5 as a progression, but in a cadential context, definitely less common than the other configurations of predominant and dominant chords. 3 is typically not treated like a predominant in that fashion, but we do see it sometimes. It's not unprecedented, but it's definitely not common either. And then we cadence on C major, C, G, E, and C. Tonic triad, root position. Our next cadence pretty clearly in the key of D minor. He's going to start moving to keys that we actually wouldn't really expect in the order that we see them, but they're not quite distant yet. We do have this phrase here, which is kind of an anomaly, but all in all, moving to the key of D minor, not super unusual. It is next to C major on the circle of fifths, and we would expect Bach to go to D minor through maybe F major, but C to D minor, moving to the key of the supertonic, not super fascinating in and of itself. We start off with F major, F, A, F, and C, just like we did the previous phrase. This is our 4 chord, passing 7th on the bass, and then kind of an unusual progression, 4 to 2, D, A, F, and D, which is our 2 chord, root position, and this C is a little bit of a elongated passing 7th that turns into a suspension in the lower voice, C, D, F, and D, which on the downbeat is a, I guess technically speaking, it would be a 2-4-2 chord. And the reason why I feel like this 2-4-2 chord is significant is because of the fact that the pattern repeats in the next phrase as well, where we have a 4-2 chord that resolves where we would expect it to. And here's really interesting, because if we just look at the bass and the way that it resolves, it is a non-chord tone, right? I think D minor is the chord that's being implied here. But when you introduce this B here, it does give us a bit of a 7 feel, right? B, D, F, and D. It's in root position. Bach does usually go out of the way pretty much every time to avoid doubling the leading tone. I've only seen it maybe once or twice in the chorales that I can remember. But 2 going to 7 is fairly unusual. I mean, arguably speaking, there is an argument that a lot of 2-7 progressions occur in Bach, because the difference between the 2 chords is usually one voice moving stepwise in a direction, because 2 in this case would be DFA, a 7 chord would be BDF. So they share 2 tones in common, and the difference is the A versus the B, and those are the notes that are a step apart. So 2 going to 7 here, whether or not this is a 7 chord or whether it's a 7-4-2 chord, a 2-4-2 chord, the chord is resolving the way that we would expect. At least the bass is resolving the way that we would expect. The chordal 7th of the 2 is moving down by step, and it eventually just goes right back up to C. So it feels like a 7 chord going to a 1 chord, but 7 going to 2, definitely uncommon. I think really this is more so a byproduct of the fact that there's not a lot of counterpoint going on, except for this syncopation in the bass that creates an unusual progression, or at least one that I don't typically associate with Bach, and they're definitely very scarce. But 7 does resolve to some type of 1 chord, C, G, F, and C. This F is a 4-3 suspension, C over the bass, passing tone in the bass as well, before we get E, C, E, and G, which is just taking our tonic, putting it in first inversion. And then we see these passing tones here in the lower voices, the B flat and the D. This is a clear indication to me that we have modulated, or we are in the process of modulating, and it's kind of an interesting progression to do it over. It almost feels to me like we're modulating on the and of the beat, but Bach does so over a very smooth figure that sort of elides the two keys together. So it's very possible that the modulation starts as early as the C chord. Maybe there's even an argument to be made here that we start as early as the D minor or the F chord. I just think with the B natural and the C natural as well, it's a little harder to justify. But, we are modulating with the C natural here as well. Just, of course, it's being contextualized with the tone that is associated with D minor. So, I don't know, 6 of one, half dozen of another. I've been calling these modulation zones in my previous analysis, and in a modulation zone, really it's that there are arguments to be made for any point. So we are modulating over a subtonic 7 here, and that immediately takes us to, get this, another 2 chord. In passing, it creates a little 2-5 2 going to 5 progression here via this 2 chord that gets introduced over the subdivision of the harmony. Now, something to take into consideration here is that this 2 going to 7 progression would be a byproduct of a subdivided progression as well. We're not seeing 7 go to 2, both numbered beats, both happening on the harmonic rhythm. Those are far less common in an otherwise still very uncommon configuration of chords. So 7 going to 2 here, it really feels like 7 is just a point that is just a point of common tone between the 2 keys, and then more chords that are more so associated with D minor start to occur afterwards. It's kind of an interesting juxtaposition of the two where they're butting up together. But this is a 2-4-2 chord, D, B flat, E and G, E minor 7 flat 5 over D, and that takes us where we would expect to a 5 chord in first inversion, C sharp, A, E and A. 5-6, and then D gets introduced here kind of in the same rhythmic configuration that we saw in the bass in the previous measure, but we also get a neighbor tone in the alto, and for the short beat we get D minor, D, A, F, and A. And then again we introduce another E minor 7 flat 5 chord over D, D, B flat, E, and G, another unusual chord to see in a cadential context. Of course, we see 2 chords all the time, but seeing them in third inversion is unusual when we're so close to the cadence. Typically 2-4-2 is a chord that we would see in the middle of the phrase in Bach, but it does resolve the way we would expect, and it's just another way to approach the tonic. C sharp and A here, when we complete with the rest of the chord, doesn't quite give us a 5-6 chord exactly, it gives us 5-6-5, so for all intents and purposes they function the same. It's just this G is being held over the course of both sets of chords here, and then we resolve the D minor, D, A, D, and F, which is our tonic triad in the key of D minor. Kind of in an interesting juxtaposition as well. We see the C natural again, but then it goes right to B natural and A, which makes me feel like this D minor is functioning like a common chord between D minor and A, and what I'm just realizing right now is that I wrote C major there because I was talking about a C major chord, and I wrote D minor here because I was talking about a D minor chord, but this is A minor. And D minor is in fact turning into our subdominant, but interestingly D minor moves in parallel. We have C, C, E, and G afterwards, which is a 3 chord, and 4 going to 3 is a relatively uncommon progression. I can't say the last time I've heard a 4 to 3 progression in Bach. Something tells me it's not unprecedented. I mean, I've looked at so many chorales now that I feel like I must have encountered this progression at least once, but the fact that they're both in root position is kind of interesting. We also have a passing 7th in the bass here before we go to A, C, F, and A. A 4-3-1 progression might be unprecedented, but 4-3 going to 6, that makes a little bit more sense, because 6, regardless of the inversion, is typically where 3 wants to resolve, because chords that are a fifth apart generally are the preferred chord progression that you see in either direction, but typically speaking it's going down, like 1 going to 5, or 5 going to 1, or 2 going to 5. That's the general chord progression that you're going to find most tonal music follow. We then have A and D here. This A is a chord tone, this D is an anticipation. I don't really think what's happening here is like a D minor chord in second inversion. It doesn't quite feel that way to me. It feels like the tenor is just meeting the bass here rhythmically for an anticipation while the bass stays syncopated. That's just my take on it. I don't feel like there is a 4-6-4 chord happening here. I don't really hear it because we get A, D, F, and B immediately afterwards. That B feels much more like the root of this chord once it gets introduced, and that would make this a 2-4-2 chord again, B minor 7 flat 5 over A, and we get a very similar resolution. We have C sharp D, G sharp D, E, and B, which is 5-6-5, like we saw in the previous cadence. This G sharp is like a delayed neighbor tone. This E is an anticipation, and then we get another imperfect authentic cadence here where we cadence, in this case, on A minor, because A minor is our tonic. And then the next phrase is completely out of nowhere from a harmonic standpoint or from a key standpoint. It just does not really make sense to me how they are related to one another, and it's just it's a very interesting juxtaposition of keys, and apologies for having to write in the fermatas here. As I mention often in my videos, I try to conserve paper as much as possible. I already print 2 pages a day. You can imagine that I go through paper relatively quickly when that's the case, so I have no problem writing the fermatas in. But after our A minor, we get this direct modulation to G minor, and what really makes it feel direct is the fact that we get F sharp against B flat happening right on the next beat. It really does feel like A minor here is not really functioning like a common chord. I think there is an argument to be made that with this progression, we could have some melodic minor going on. We do have E, we do have F sharp, and we do have G, but A minor does not feel like a connected idea when I listen to it. It is technically part of a rising melodic minor figure here, but I feel like that's more consequent or coincidental rather than it being intentional. Of course, the possibility is there. You could analyze this as a common chord modulation. This just feels more direct to me. Then again, it is up in the air. I did just make a very valid point. And maybe that is the gateway if Bach was trying to create a common tone modulation or a common chord modulation between the two keys. That would be the way to do it, or at least one of the ways to do it. There are other ways to do it as well, like a D major chord, for example, like what's happening on the next beat. But I feel like that would have to be part of an otherwise melodic minor figure in the context of A minor too. But here we're seeing like A go to D, go to not exactly to G. We do get a bit of a turnaround before we get the exact cadence, which is another imperfect authentic cadence, this time in the key of G minor. So possibly speaking, if you're like more of a literalist, we have D, D, F sharp, and B flat, which is B flat augmented in first inversion, 3 + 6. But I don't think that's really what's happening here. I think this B flat's an accented non-chord tone, and this D, while it not being an accented non-chord tone, C meets the resolution to this accented non-chord tone here, which is A. Of course, we did see a 3 go to 5 progression earlier, but it doesn't quite feel like this B flat is a chord tone here. It really does feel more like an expressive tone. You could analyze this as a 3 to 5 progression. I'm just going to analyze this as a big 5-7 chord, just because, like I said, the B flat does not quite feel it doesn't quite feel like an augmented chord is happening here for any extended period of time. But again, you could also make the argument that the 5 chord really isn't happening for any extended period of time. My only argument being that we have the foundation of the 5 chord in the lower 3 voices, which is really what drives the harmony here. And Bach has made some questionable harmonic choices in this chorale as well, so everything is to be taken with a grain of salt. After the 5 chord, we get another kind of deceptive progression here. We have E, B flat, G, and G, which is E diminished in root position. This is a byproduct of the G melodic minor scale. This is where we get a very clear G melodic minor, unlike this little brief melodic minor figure we have here, where this E, I guess, could be tacked onto this F sharp and G here, but I don't really feel like that's what's happening. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't need to talk about it anymore, but this E chord becomes diminished because that's a byproduct of raising the root up a half step due to it being a melodic minor scale. And then we get 4 notes moving off of the harmonic rhythm. That typically indicates that there is a chord progression happening, and it would make sense here because we are closing in on a cadence. And just like how Bach has in the previous 3 phrases, we've seen Bach subdivide the last beat before our final cadential chord with the dominant F sharp, A, D, and A. This time it's just 5-6, not 5-6-5 or anything, or 5-4-3, just 5, a triad. And then we cadence on G minor, G, G, D, and B flat. Very unusual to see G minor in the context of C major. We have seen a chorale where Bach oscillates between G minor and C major almost exclusively throughout the chorale, and he uses C major as the subdominant and the tonic of G minor and C major respectively. So it's not like G minor and C major are the most distant of keys, but hypothetically speaking, if we're using the circle of fifths as our foundation here, yeah, they are distant keys because they don't diatonically have any chords in common. I want to make sure that I'm right when I say that. Yeah, I don't think diatonically they have... No, they do diatonically have one chord in common. They have F major. But, you know, Bach does use the subtonic to modulate between in many cases. It's just, it is one of the lesser used chords. Many cases because he modulates a ton, but definitely one of the lesser used chords. But we do get a direct modulation to C major here, just because we go from G minor directly to D minor. And of course there is the argument to be made here that D minor is our minor dominant and we're using it as a common chord to modulate back to C, kind of in the same way that A minor is a bit of a stretch in that regard, where you could say it is a harmonization of the melodic minor scale. It doesn't quite feel that way to me. With G minor going to D minor, they feel like 2 totally separate ideas. Just like seeing A minor going to D major, it feels like 2 separate ideas when you hear the B flat in there. If we heard B natural, then I would think we were going to G major. But starting off the phrase, we do start with D minor, D, A, F, and A, which is our 2 chord, passing 7th in the bass before we get B natural, D, F, and G. It's another 5 chord, G7 over B, 5-6-5. This G is a root. It's the root of our chord. It's a chord tone. We don't need to mark it. And then we get C major, C, D, E, and G. And in a really roundabout fashion, this really feels like where the end of the chorale should occur. But like I was mentioning, in a roundabout fashion, we get G, C, D, and G, which is our 5 chord. And the way that Bach cadences and brings attention to the third of the chord like this and turns the C into the 4, or into a 4-3 suspension over the bass, really makes us feel like we're getting an imperfect, or like a plagal cadence in the key of G. So I will leave that out there, that maybe this is a plagal cadence, but to me, after listening to it for a long enough time, it sounds like a half cadence to me. And it's just one of these interesting ending phrases, or just an interesting phrase where Bach subverts our expectations by playing with a chord and turning it into something that it isn't. I mean, Bach already, we see that there is a lot of emphasis on G throughout the chorale, G, 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 G. Of course, it is being contextualized as the dominant in the key of C, but it looks like the melody works its way back towards G being the focal pitch at the end of this fragment of the melody as well. Yeah, we're seeing Bach perhaps pay an homage to that while also staying in the key of the macro level tonic of the chorale. But I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about from an analytical standpoint. We have the distant modulation, this possible augmented triad's pretty interesting as well, and these 2-7 or 7-2 progressions are definitely something to write home about as well. They don't happen all that often, and the fact that they're happening as frequently as they are in one phrase makes me definitely very curious about what's going on in this chorale. But when you listen to it, the progression doesn't quite have the same tonal polish that the other chorales have. It feels like the chords moving between them are tertian and they're vaguely tonal, but not quite as codifiably tonal as progressions we've heard in the past. But Bach does that from time to time. He has a very robust relationship with the harmony, and that shows in chorales like these, where he can deviate from the norms and show us that, you know, there's more than just fives and ones going on in this chorale, and there are other ways to approach them, and another way to demonstrate that certain keys are related to one another as well. But that's everything that I have to say about today's chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon as well, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.